Hello, everybody. Great to see you. Great to see so many friends here. My name is Kim Daniels. I'm the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown University, where we work to bring principles of Catholic social thought to national and global conversations, build bridges across political and religious divides, and encourage young people to see their faith as an asset in their life and work. I want to welcome all of you here to Georgetown. As some of you may know, this is a difficult time for our community, as Georgetown's president, Jack DeGioia, is experiencing serious health challenges. Thank you for keeping President DeGioia in your hearts and in your prayers. And now I want to welcome you to our public dialogue on the vocation of a journalist in a time of testing, lessons from David Carr. We're so grateful for all of you joining us here in person for this full house in Georgetown's ICC auditorium. And we have nearly 1,500 of you a part of this dialogue today, including the hundreds of you here tonight in person, and the 1,100 of you who are here watching online at this moment, and the many hundreds more who will watch after that. We've held over 165 gatherings since our founding 10 years ago, and are so glad that since we began streaming, we've been able to reach some 340,000 people nationally and internationally. And for your friends who can't watch tonight, our conversation will be recorded and posted for later viewing. So today we're here to talk about journalism, its role in our democracy, the responsibilities of those who work to shape and disseminate information and ideas, threats facing journalists, and the forces shaping people's access to accurate information and constructive discourse. At a time when truth seems elusive, distrust in media is widespread, and journalism is being transformed by market forces and technology. What are the enduring moral, professional, and personal responsibilities of journalists? How is journalism not just a career, but a calling? What responsibilities do journalists have given their key role in public life? This public dialogue takes as a starting point in answering those questions the life and work of David Carr, who was a reporter and media columnist for the New York Times from 2002 to 2015, after editing the Twin City Reader and Washington City Paper and writing for the Atlantic Monthly and New York Magazine. David Carr saw journalism as a vocation and covering the changing media landscape with his persistent reporting, powerful writing, and idiosyncratic ways. Tonight, we've brought together 5 respected reporters and writers mentored by David Carr to explore the lessons they learned and examine what time-honored values and new responsibilities should shape journalism at this time of testing in American life, for American media, and for our democracy. They are Ta-Nehisi Coates, an award-winning journalist and author of 5 books, including Between the World and Me, which won the National Book Award. Ta-Nehisi was a senior editor and writer at The Atlantic. Claire Giangrave, the Vatican reporter for Religion News Service, where she covers the Catholic Church and Pope Francis. She was previously the faith and culture reporter for Crux. Amanda Ripley, a Washington Post contributing columnist and the co-founder of Good Conflict, a media and training company. She's a New York Times best-selling author of 3 books on human behavior and a former senior writer for Time magazine. Jake Tapper, the lead Washington anchor for CNN and the host of The Lead with Jake Tapper and co-host of State of the Union on Sunday mornings. And Eric Wemple, the Washington Post media critic and a graduate of the Wall School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. Moderating our conversation tonight will be my friend and colleague John Carr, the founder of our Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, and most importantly for our purposes here tonight, David Carr's older brother. So please help me in welcoming this wonderful group.
Thanks very much, Kim. We wondered if anyone would come out on a hot night in June. You got to make that announcement you make in church. Press to the ends of the pew so that the latecomers can come. Tonight is about journalism, and it's about a journalist. I'm both honored and anxious to be the moderator for this dialogue on the vocation of a journalist. Lessons from David Carr. I'm anxious because I'm sitting next to Jake Tamper, who does this 6 days a week. And in 9 days is going to moderate a debate between President Biden and former President Trump. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Thanks
Tonight
for the,
we
thanks
do
for the,
not-
Thanks for the reminder.
We do not have the switch that turns off the microphone, so you need to stick to your time limits. I'm honored to be here because of two connections. One connection, as Kim said, I'm the founder of this initiative here at Georgetown. Kim is doing a superb job of leading the initiative into our second decade, and I'm happy to help. But why would an initiative on Catholic social thought and public life organize a dialogue on the vocation of a journalist? First, because the central themes of our initiative and Catholic social teaching are promotion of dialogue and the pursuit of the common good. And journalism can either advance the common good or undermine it. It can contribute to dialogue or it can destroy it. Second, the theme of vocation is at the heart of our initiative. The idea that work is an expression of our dignity, and therefore the work of reporters, writers, and broadcasters is not simply a way to make a living, but a contribution to society through the eyes of faith and service. Journalism is more than a profession. It is a calling. It is a vocation. Third, a part of our mission at the initiative is to advance the message of Pope Francis. And Pope Francis offered a foundation for our dialogue earlier this year when he told Vatican journalists, Claire, you might have been at this gathering. See if you remember this. He said, in Italian, journalism is a calling that emerges at a young age and which leads you to understanding, shedding light, and recounting. I wish for you to return to the roots of this vocation. How much you need to know and to tell, on the one hand, and how much you need to cultivate an unconditional love of truth, on the other. The other reason I am your moderator tonight is because, as Kim has said, I am David Carr's brother. Imagine what it was like to be David Carr's older brother. My brother Joe and his wife Mary are here, and my sisters and brothers are online watching this. When we tried to organize this, we tried to think how we could do it. And so what we did was try and look back at the work and lessons from one particular journalist, David Carr, who loved his craft, did the work, made mistakes, and covered media in the world in his own often odd, sort of Minnesota nice, New York smart aleck way. He did that in the New York Times, he did it at the Washington City paper, the Twin City Reader, and others. David collapsed and died of complications of lung cancer in the Times newsroom 9 years ago. The publisher said David Carr was one of the most gifted journalists who has ever worked at the Times. And the managing editor called him the finest media reporter of his generation and one of the leaders of our newsroom. He was our biggest champion. Needless to say, it was not always clear that David would find his way from our loving and crazy Irish Catholic home in Minnesota through years of addiction and turmoil to writing a media column every Monday morning in the Times, or that his life and work would serve as an example for others. David was a son and brother, a husband, a father, an alcoholic and a crack addict, a survivor of one cancer and a victim of another, a person of faith and a lot of fun. He was not your typical New York Times reporter or columnist. He was in treatment 5 times. He attended a series of Minnesota state schools on the 7-year plan. He gave a commencement address at Berkeley, which I recommend to you, and he said he woke up in the middle of the night and had to call the University of Minnesota and say, I really did graduate, didn't I? And the answer was he did. Shortly after he started at the Times, an excerpt of David's memoir, The Night of the Gun, a reporter investigates the darkest story of his life, his own life, was the cover story for the Sunday Times magazine. The photo cover, the cover of the Sunday Times magazine, were 6 of David's mugshots from when he was arrested. And I can only imagine what the elevator ride on Monday morning was like with his new colleagues after this was published. In addition to his work as a reporter and columnist, David leaves 2 lasting legacies. The first are the women who saved his life, helped him recover who he was, and helped him become the person he wanted to be. With us tonight are David's 3 daughters. Erin Lee Carr is a documentary filmmaker who has directed and produced films for HBO, Netflix, and Hulu. Most recently, the document Stormy, although I think she had a premiere last night. She wrote All That You Leave Behind, which included David's lessons for her. Megan Carr is a clinical psychologist working at the VA Connecticut Healthcare with a dual appointment at the Yale School of Medicine. Megan and her husband, Ed Kramkowski, who is with us tonight, have a 2-year-old son named David. Madeline Carr is an investigative researcher working in film and television, often alongside her sister, Erin. And also with us is David's wife and partner, Jill Rooney Carr, who is the editor of Final Draft of the collected works of David Carr, which you can find in the resources. Jill is the only person I know who could consistently hold her own with David. In his amazing commencement address at Berkeley, David tells the young journalists about the importance of thinking big. And these were his words. I was 34 years old, washed out of my profession, on welfare, terrible reputation, single parent, and I just met the woman who would be my wife. And Jill said, where do you see yourself 5 years from now? And he said, well, I want to be a figure in the national media scene. And Jill said, well, honey, you're unemployed right now. And David said, I know, I'm just trying to articulate a goal. And he reached his goal. The second part of David's legacy is an amazing number of journalists he hired, mentored, encouraged, yelled at, and supported. One of the tributes to David after his death was an Atlantic piece entitled The David Carr Generation. Several of the people in that article are on this stage tonight and in this auditorium, and many more benefited from help. If you are a journalist and David Carr encouraged you in your profession, raise your hand. Look at that. And then online, lots of people are waving their hand. We will share some of those connections and stories as we discuss the vocation of journalists in a time of testing, lessons from David Carr. To begin the conversation, I'm going to ask the entire panel 2 questions, general questions, and ask for a relatively brief response to start us off. And then I'm going to have a more extended conversation with each of them. This is a time of testing for journalism. We're in a bitter election year, a world at war, fights over fake news. What is one thing journalists should do and should avoid doing in a time of testing? Let's begin with you, Jake.
Thanks, John. So first of all, let me just say what an honor it is to be here at Georgetown, and most importantly, with these amazing journalists to my sides, old friends and one new one, and of course, in front of the amazing Carr family. It's great to be here. I think that, well, let me just start with one of my first David Carr memories, which is one of the first stories I wrote for him as a full-time employee. I was a freelancer first. and I could go into what the story was, but you don't care. The important part about it was that I made a mistake and kind of blithely dismissed it. I confused two different women that both had the same first name, but that didn't mean they were the same woman. And I kind of glossed over it blithely, as was my wont at that age, and David did not take well to that, and I hear that voice every time I make a mistake, every time. And I think that one of the most important things we in journalism can do is remember that we are fighting for the legitimacy of journalism and fighting for facts and truth every day, every time we step up to the plate. And it is important that we get it right because we are, I think, in a way that I haven't seen in my 55 years, really fighting for the soul of journalism and fighting for trust. Michael Crichton came up with a term called Gell-Mann amnesia. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it, but Gell-Mann amnesia is when you pick up a newspaper. It could be watch a news show on TV too, I suppose, but when he came up with it, you pick up a newspaper and you read an article about something that you know a lot about, and you realize not only does the journalist not know anything about it, they have everything completely wrong, like 100% wrong on its head. And then you read the article and you're like, the person doesn't know what they're talking about. And then you turn the page and you read another article and you just completely forget that the first journalist had no idea what they're talking about. You just assume this next one does. And I feel like Gell-Mann amnesia, we benefit from Gell-Mann amnesia in journalism. And I feel like it's less and less prevalent. People are remembering mistakes. People are remembering when we get things wrong. And we just need to continue to fight for our credibility in the way David would hector us to were he here.
Great. Claire, in this time, what is one thing journalists should do, should not do? If you want to tell a story about David, go ahead.
Well, I would also like to say that I'm honored to be here in front of David's family. Who would ever say that a young journalist watching David on the screen of a New York Times documentary would one day be here surrounded by all these amazing people? But I was in his class for a period, and I really wanted to be in that class. And let me tell you, he was a hard professor. He was difficult. He requested and asked so much from us. And we all were dying to please him, to be good at what we were doing and show him how much we were working hard for him. And one thing he really didn't like was when we were lazy. He did not like a lazy journalist. And it's so easy to be a lazy journalist. And now that I have a couple years of journalism under my belt, it's even easier sometimes to do that. And I mean, you mentioned hearing that voice in your head of David, and every time, I think about, I don't really want to go to this place, or that's so far. It's his voice telling me, go there, be there. And journalists have the chance to be where history is being made. And that voice just follows me. So the no thing with David was like, don't be lazy. And I've kept that with me. And it sort of follows with the do's, because you mentioned trust. A lot of readers don't trust us. I was sitting outside with someone who maybe is here in the crowd, who told me, I told him I was a journalist. He said, I don't trust journalists. Pretty straightforward. We were having a great conversation, and he just kind of backed up, and I'm so used to that reaction. But if you're there and you talk to people the way David told us to be, then you can build that trust, and you know more, so you can really tell the story fully.
Eric, forget about my pompous question. What is a lesson from David that is important for journalists to know today?
I was really excited about this question. But let me go with the do. Go into the office. Because, David Carr, much of the magic that we felt from David Carr was personal. It was in the office. It was interactions. It was just basically sucking off of his energy and using it. And you could not love journalism and work with David Carr. That was an impossible transaction. And he was just always in the office, really excited, really, really pumped up. And so you go to the office if you're a journalist. I would hate to think what would have happened in a post-pandemic world had Carr, lived a couple decades later, because we might not all be as sort of like enlightened by his presence, because he was such a powerful force one-on-one or in group settings. And so go to the office, and as there's some hypocrisy there too, because I'm 2 or 3 times a week, but that's that's not cutting it. So I don't want to sit here holier than thou, but that would be my point.
Tell the story, if you're willing to, the first time you heard David and Ta-Nehisi together.
Oh, that was
Oh, God.
that was stereophonic.
Oh, jeez.
Dave, I didn't know who was in there, but I had the city paper was very cheaply built. It had like maybe 1/8 of an inch of drywall between, and David Plotz, who's here, knows this as well as I do. You could hear everything he was doing, every phone conversation. And when Ta-Nehisi, there was someone else in there with you that day. I forgot who it was, but they were just, oh my God, oh no, you can't tell me that. And then Tony's, I can tell you that. And it was just all this. It was the greatest energy you can. And at some point, I'm like, I can't edit like this. But, of course, you don't go in the Carr's office and tell him to shush. Like, that's just not something you do. But it was honestly one of the most memorable moments of my life in journalism, and it was just yelling. But it was glorious, happy, right, Ta-Nehisi?
It was incredible.
So what's your version and what lesson for journalists from that?
Oh, man. I'm sorry, I just got off a flight, so I'm trying to, draw it down and not ramble here, because my brain's basically mush and pouring out my ear. Why don't I stick with the do and the don't, so
Okay.
I don't, like...
All right, I'm game. All right. It's just these people who don't follow directions.
I think the do is actually quite simple, and I'm actually going to build off of what Claire said in terms of laziness. Do report. Do report. And Claire made this point subtly just now, that after 2 years of experience, it's easier to not report. The older you get, the easier it becomes. Because as a journalist, if you're lucky, your reputation advances, and people start to think that you are a font of singular genius. And you're not. You're not. We live in an era that is overrun with opinion and is under-resourced in stories. And I'm speaking from personal experience now. It's only in the past year that I've, really, been forced to remember this and to really, really see this. But sitting in a room with somebody and having them tell you about their lives, it's not the same as reading a report about a group of people that person belongs to. It's not the same even as getting them on Zoom or getting them on the phone. You have to feel people. You have to really, really, feel people to get a sense of who they are. And so, one of the unfortunate things is I just feel like we have a lot of people right now who are quote unquote journalists, but maybe aren't doing the heart of the thing that we most think journalists should do. I know it was the thing that David was most trying to reinforce in me, because I came to him, I don't know, wanting to be some sort of pontificating, what we would call a pundit today. And there was just no way to keep a job like that. There was no way to work a city paper like that. I had to, what was it, ANCs, Eric? I had to go report on the ANCs, yeah. You had to learn how to do that. And that was important. That was my college education right there. And the thing I would say don't do, don't tweet. Don't tweet. Don't tweet. And I'm probably biased because I've been gone for a while now. And the
It's
first,
actually not called Twitter anymore.
oh yeah, sorry, don't X.
I know you've been gone.
Don't X. Don't X people, whatever it's called. Don't do it. It was bad before. It is worse now. Whatever excuses you had before, whatever justifications you had before are gone. The company is run by somebody who, pretty straightforwardly has no interest in the truth. And I don't know why so many people who are in a vocation that is supposed to be devoted to truth spend so much time on it. So.
Amanda, do's and don'ts.
Okay. So I go to the office, and I also once you get there, leave, right? Is that what you were saying? Get out. Remember, he used to walk around and yell at us if there were too many of us in the office. Remember? He'd be like, go, get out, talk to people. He was not interested in our hot takes, right? Not at all. And at the same time, he had this way of making us feel like we could do anything. How many people here worked at City Paper at some point? I see plots. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about. I, to this day, do not know how he did this, nor do I know how he sustained it, because he was old enough and experienced enough to know that actually anything is not possible. We were not capable of doing it, but he made us feel like we were. So it was this interesting duality of you can do anything. You're no worse than anyone else. But also, I'm not interested in your hot take. You know what I mean? You just thinking aloud is not interesting. Go talk to people. You don't know anything. Go get a story. So I think those two things continue to be true. But honestly, I think we should just acknowledge that a lot of things have changed, right? So I struggle with this question a little bit because I feel like it's a very tricky time to be a journalist, especially a working journalist like that end of the panel, who are doing it every day. And I think in a time of conflict like this, an age of runaway conflict, any intuitive thing you do usually has no impact or makes things worse. That's one thing I've learned about conflict. And so journalists have to do counterintuitive things. The last thing I'll say is I get a lot of great advice on journalism from reporters who have worked in other countries with even worse conflict than what we have. And I was talking to a Venezuelan reporter, and he said, if a country is divided into separate echo chambers, it doesn't matter how loudly you scream in one. They can't hear you in the other. So the intuition is to get louder, to be more convicted, to be more righteous, right? To catastrophize about the future. And I would argue that it's worth at least considering doing the opposite of that, because if you just do what's intuitive, you're feeding the beast of the conflict.
Thank you. Jake, let me come back to you. People know State of the Nation, The Lead. You told your story about starting at City Paper. You wrote a powerful book about our military, and you've written 3 novels which tell us what you really think about Washington, and it's worse than we know. They're bestsellers. But what people may not know, one of David's things I always heard him say, he would describe a situation, and he would say, someone ought to write a story about that. It's how he started. And what I've read is your father, who was a physician, treated a young man who was accused of a terrible crime. And your father decided that he couldn't have done that crime. He wasn't physically capable of that. And so in 2011, you wrote a story about that called This Is Not Justice. And it's the story of C.J. Rice. And with your work and a lot of other people's work, because you wrote a story about that, in 1923, his conviction was overturned, and last March, you broke the story of his exoneration, and he would be a free man. What do young journalists need to know about someone ought to do a story about that, and in particular, as a broadcaster, maybe the preeminent broadcaster in our country, how can television journalism tell a story about our country that does something about the anger and polarization and bitter divides that haunt not only politics but also media.
So I mean, what Amanda said, I think is what everybody said is very wise, but in terms of what I do for a living, what Amanda said was very resonant because it's very easy for a television broadcaster to get a lot of attention by preaching to a choir. They're sitting there, they're waiting to be preached at, and you'll get a good rating. But that's not the best journalism, that's just the best rating. And I think getting out of comfort zones is a very important part of that. We have some great reporters, Elle Reeve and Donia Sullivan, among them, who go to try to understand groups of people that maybe our viewers are not parts of, in terms of people who go to Donald Trump's rallies or whatever. And I think trying to get out of I mean, there are two different questions kind of baked into your question, because first of all, there is the fact that journalism can really matter. And the story about C.J. Rice and my dad's effort to get him out of prison, and then the lawyers, obviously, that my dad hired to help get him out of prison, that story and the book I wrote about Afghanistan to this day remain far and above the most meaningful projects of journalism I've ever done. And you might notice they're both print. And I think David would find that amusing. But then beyond that, there is also, can you apply the lessons of really going deep on a subject and really trying to understand every fact about a subject so that you become if not the world expert on C.J. Rice or Combat Outpost Keating, and can that change the world? I don't know how much it can change the world, but it changed C.J.'s world, my dad's work on that. And I think Amanda's, I don't know that we're going to solve the divides in this country through journalism, but journalism can be a solution to bringing people together, or at least helping them to understand each other at a time when there is just so much demonization of the other side by everyone.
Thank you. You've come a long way from the city paper. 9 days, you're going to be moderating with your colleague, Dana Bash, this debate.
Again, a reminder that I'm of the most stressful experience of my life. I appreciate it.
I think it would be very useful if you stayed behind and let everyone tell you what question you want.
Well, everybody who's emailing them and sending them to me on Instagram, those are the questions I'm asking. 100%, every single thing.
Well, you shouldn't do this, but I am. What are they going to do about poverty and hunger in America would be a good question. But since we're not going to give you questions, in a general way, how do you see these responsibilities and challenges? And if you could imagine, what advice would David give you?
Oh boy, we lost David in 2015, and he's number one on my list of journalists that we lost that I really would love to know what he thought about the last 8 years, 9 years. You got Chris Hitchens is in there, Michael Kelly is in there, there are others, but boy, would I love to know what he thinks about this. I think that probably all of us are guided by Carr's influence in a way that maybe wasn't even completely enumerated at the time, which is tell the truth, have allegiance to the facts and the truth, call out lies, call out indecency, but don't preach, report. And I think that, I've tried to, and not always succeeded, in following that instruction. You couldn't really tell, as I recall, maybe I'm remembering wrong, but you couldn't really tell David's politics from reading his column necessarily. And I think that that's just a good touchstone for journalists in general and how I intend to conduct the debate with Dana Bash.
Terrific. Ta-Nehisi, you've done so many things since the City Paper. National Book Award, an article that changed the national debate on reparations and racial justice, several books, The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, and a novel, Water Dancer. The part I don't begin to understand is you've written a Black Panther series.
Captain America.
Captain America. And the part I want to understand is you got a Genius Grant. So
I'd like to understand that too.
how do you apply for those?
Step one, be a genius. Step
But-
two, question mark. Step three, get the grant.
The story I want to tell, my daughter teaches in an inner city school in Baltimore. And this book, Between the World and Me, was really important to her. And you were doing a signing. And she hung back. Her name is Molly. And at the very end, she came up and said, I think you might know my uncle. And you said, take out the book and turn to the dedication page. And it says, for David and Kenyatta, who believed. So why David, Kenyatta, for those who don't know, is your wife who has believed. But why David, and what did David do for you, and what would he offer other young journalists in the middle of this mess?
You know, after hearing Amanda say that he made us feel like we could do anything, but he probably knew we couldn't, I'm wondering.
No, it's really tricky.
It is. But, I mean, look, I started at Washington City Paper when I was 20 years old. I was a terrible, terrible college student. I've been a terrible student for my entire scholastic career. Whatever self-esteem I had, I derived from my social relationships. I was, pretty good in that area. But I was not a great athlete at all, even though I was 6'4". And I just wasn't a good student. And so to come someplace at that young of age, and we were all young, and to halfway be good at something, I was like a B- journalist at City, but that was a considerable improvement. To be that, and to be okay there was like insane, like it was crazy. And to Amanda's point, again, I'm only 20 years old, but he would like pull out articles. I mean, there's an article, I used to do music criticism. It was like after Tupac got killed, the New Yorker went and got like these depositions from a case he was in and wrote this beautiful feature. And he gave it to me. He said, I expect you to do that. You know what I mean? And he would like pull out these articles from Vanity Fair or whatever, these long features. And he would say, why aren't we doing this? You know what I mean? And when I later left a City Paper, and I had, just some of the most depressing times of my life, as a journalist at some of the places I worked. 'Cause I was under the misapprehension that every journalistic job was like City Paper. And, it didn't go so well. And just over and over again, he would be like, you're not wrong, they are. And this is the dude that used to yell at me, about how wrong I was. You know what I mean? So, it's not somebody that goes soft on you, so they must be wrong. They must be wrong. I had an editor, I'll never forget this, man. I had an editor who, at a publication, didn't go so well, did some things that were not so well, and this is how David was, man. He came up to the New York Times and got around his friends, and somehow my name came up, and David went right at this dude in front of all of these people in the New York Times. I mean, he just was a constant backer, and there really was no on-paper evidence. Well, let me put it, there weren't many people who agreed. My wife agreed, my family agreed, you know what I mean? But outside of that, you know what I mean? Like there weren't many, people who agreed. And he just would say over and over again. And I think like I am often deeply, deeply sad. I don't want to say this the wrong way, but that he didn't get to see some of this because it's his. You know what I mean? Like it really, really belongs to him. And there were so many times when I was like, I'm going to go drive a cab, and he was like, the whole world is wrong. And you're right, and you just don't, there was just no way any of this happens, without him. It's like my parents, my wife, and him. That's it.
That's powerful. You work in two worlds, writing, journalism, and questions of racial justice. In what ways has journalism set back racial justice? In what ways has it moved it forward? And what should be going on now?
Well, setting it back is pretty easy. I mean, newspapers were one of the biggest boosters of lynch mobs in this country and one of the greatest urges. I mean, we did quite a bit of damage. When I came into the field, I think a lot of the magazines that I ended up writing for, working for, thought it, relatively normal to write about black people, but to have no black people writing in the mag. That was just normal. That only changed, really, frankly, after Obama became president. That's when it started to change. David was ahead of his time in that. I came in as an intern. The other intern I came in was Jelani Cobb, who's dean of the journalism school at Columbia now and is, a staff writer for The New Yorker. That was the other intern. You know what I mean? So he saw things. I mean, he just clearly saw things, and he had a deep sense of that, before it was cool or whatever, or before it became necessary. Having said that, the thing that really attracted me to the City Paper and the City Paper style of journalism was, at its core, it's something that Jake was saying, which is that it's this kind of core pursuit of truth. But you could use like all of these tools, you know what I mean? Like I could go down to Martin Luther King Library, and spend days in Washingtonia, trying to understand the history, the District of Columbia, and then you would mix that with going to, actually interviewing live people to see how they experienced it. And David loved beautiful writing, you know what I mean? So he wanted you to write, you know what I mean, to communicate that in a really beautiful way. And my basic formula of writing really has not changed since I was 20 years old. I mean, that's the same thing I try to execute over and over. It's the same mix,
Thank you. Amanda, you're part of that core at City Paper. You were covering the courts and crime. You went on Time Magazine, covering the world, especially Europe. And now you've written these amazing books about the smartest kids in the world, about who survives a disaster and who doesn't, and especially now about conflict. Talk about conflict and journalism based on your experience from back in the day at City Paper, but also your work at Time Magazine. You're a contributor to the Post, and the work you do with your organization called Good Conflict. How do journalists make conflict worse? How can they make it better? How can the common good, one of our ideas, break out every once in a while?
I will do that. But can I first offer just 2 amendments that you can take or leave? So you said, I think, that there was no on-paper evidence for his conviction. And all that guy had was paper, like on-paper evidence from your writing. It wasn't like a gift or a hunch, just to correct the record. You don't have to agree, but I just want to say, and also I know, I can imagine you've said how painful it is that he didn't live long enough. And everyone in this room has things that we wish he had lived longer to see. But the thing is, he did see it, like before everyone. Anyway, see? I made it all better. Look at that. So let's go back to conflict, and let's fix that. We got like 5 minutes. So actually, speaking of your writing, one of my favorite lines that you wrote about David was, David loved newspapers and hated bullies. Just a real simple line. And I think that's why this would be a really hard time for David. I know he would survive. Like, I'm pretty sure he'd be canceled, but then he would come back. Don't you? Does the family agree? Like, he would find a way back and redeem himself and make it right. But he would be really sad about what has happened to newspapers, and he would be really sad because, so this is a terrible time for newspapers, as you all know, and just an absolute boom time for bullies. So in some ways, it would be great to hear what he thinks and what he would say and how he would just take them to task. But he also couldn't fix this, because journalism can't fix this alone. And I think it's important to meet people where they are. And when David Carr hired us, about 35 to 40% of Americans said they trusted the news. It's now half that. Meanwhile, 40% of Americans trust the police. So Americans actually trust the police, the medical system, big technology companies, and banks more than journalists. And this is painful, right? And we could spend all night arguing about why that is and whose fault it is and who's right and who's wrong. But I like to think about, if your spouse trusted you less than banks and big technology companies, you could spend your whole life arguing about how you'd been misunderstood and villainized, right? But at the end of the day, you got to fix that relationship, right? You got to do something very different than anything we did at City Paper. And I don't have the answer for that, but I know that it has to look really, really different. You got to give people something they don't have right now. Because they don't need hot takes. They don't even need to know what happened. They got that. What happened, whatever. You know what they need? They need evidence-based hope. They need a sense of agency. They need to know what to do. They need to know what other people are doing to fix things, even when they fail. That's what people need. And I feel like, I don't know, but David Carr knew how to adapt. Right? He knew how to evolve. And I feel like he'd do it better than me, but somehow he'd figure this out and find a way to be useful and relevant.
Wow. He'd find some really weird way to say that was really smart.
Profane.
Yeah, well, yeah. Let me turn to Eric. Eric, anything going on in your paper? Eric shares some tender turf with David in that he is a media critic at a major media outlet, the Washington Post. I did not know David was respected as much as he was. I always thought he'd get fired. And I thought especially he'd get fired when he would talk about his bosses. One time he wrote a column that says my workplace turned into a bad episode of Game of Thrones. And I thought, well, this is it. But you have a remarkable ability, at least I think so, of being an equal opportunity critic. You take on the right, you take on the left, you take on the mainstream when they make mistakes. You stand up for standards. You don't preach to the choir, which must be hard when you're in a little bit of a choir maybe some days. But that model is in trouble. The Washington Post lost $70 million they've shared with us. And now they're trying to figure out. So my question amid all that is, what are the common elements of how media institutions get in trouble, whether they're left, right, or mainstream? And what are the differences?
That's a really good question. I appreciate the preamble there. It's very kind. But and this is something I do sort of relate to David. You know, like David, one of the things at City Paper was you would be getting calls and emails at all hours from him. He poured everything into the feature stories he edited. He was working around the clock. I think the last time I saw him was when I was driving down from New York State to visit my brother. I had some cider donuts. I arrived at David's house in Montclair at like 12 midnight. He was on the back porch smoking and drinking coffee and working and reading, and he never stopped working. So like one of the things, I'm just trying to make this transition here, is that news organizations, when they put out these big stories, they put their life, they pour their souls into these pieces. And when they turn out to be fucked up, they can never, ever, it takes them forever to come to grips with it. So people on the outside, well, why can't you just admit this is wrong? And it's like, no, we sweated over this. You know, we edited this 5 times. It went through 15 layers. You know, we lawyered it. And it's just like there's this emotional attachment to the work. And when news organizations drag their heels, take the gang rape story with Rolling Stone and UVA, it took them like months or years to really, you know, they finally had to commission an investigation. I think that is what is common to most media crises, because it's not just the first mistake, it's often the refusal and the stubborn resistance to change or to correct. And I think that is actually, you know, editors will get in these contexts, just like this all the time, and say, well, you know, if we make a mistake, we correct it. And that's just not often the case, or not often enough the case. And I believe it's because of that. It's because journalism is a travail. It's very, very difficult. And when you talked about earlier as a calling, and you talked about David calling the university in the middle of the night, every journalist that's worth salt doesn't sleep many nights a week, especially on the eve of something that's published, because they think there's something wrong in that copy. And my editors always said, let's publish, let's time this for 6 a.m. No, don't time it for 6 a.m. And there are many, many times when I sit out on the steps outside of my wife's and my room, I turn on the light, and I check something that just woke me up. And that is what Carr did. It didn't bother him. That's the way he lived. He lived, like, I feel that he packed more into his life than I have, and I'm outliving him already. So that's what I would say, is that is the problem with journalists, you know, journalists correcting their errors. Too much of their heart and soul is in that piece, and they just can't bring themselves to admit it. And so if that's an answer to the question, I stand by it. But I also wanted to make one point, what Ta-Nehisi was saying about David. There's an echo, because David used to tell me all those stories. He loved Tan. He'd always talk about Tan and all the troubles he was in with this editor or that editor, and I just go, God damn, don't they see it? And so there's a great echo there. Anyway, that's just another source.
Just a quick follow-up, because we could go forever on this. Doesn't ideology play a part in this? If there is a refusal to fix things, isn't there a starting point at Fox that's different than MSNBC?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I don't think there's any question about it, but that, Fox News lies all the time or allows lies. I mean, we have the Dominion suit to prove that. And whenever I get in trouble or someone from Fox complains to me, I just say Dominion. Dominion. It's all you need to say. And like CNN, MSNBC, I feel they all have their faults. Their faults is not that they lie all the time. Their faults, myopia, sometimes some bad reporting creeps in. but I don't feel it's like they're deliberately trying to hoodwink their audience. But I've written critically of Jake's employer and MSNBC, the other major cable networks, and it's not the same. It's just not the same. The lies on the right are really, 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 they're just everywhere. And you can't, it's just like, it's whack-a-mole, you can't beat it back. But the problems in mainstream news organizations and on the left are still serious. They're just not all lies,
Claire, you bring a lot to tonight. In some ways, the most important thing is you never worked at the Washington City paper. You represent the next generation of David Carr generation. I don't know if people know, David taught a course at Boston University with a title I couldn't understand. Press play, making and distributing content in the present future. So you can diagram that sentence if you can. But this was not David with, this generation. It was an entirely new generation. He said he was a hired teacher. I read his syllabus last night. He said, "Don't raise your hand in class. This isn't Montessori." If you text or email during class, I will ignore you as you ignore me. It won't go well. And then I'm used to being told that people have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
What was it like to have David as a teacher, and what role did he have in you choosing to go into journalism, including your decision to go into religious journalism? Religion News Service, if you don't know it, is doing remarkable work on something that touches the lives of most Americans. And we don't understand it and we don't appreciate it. But Clara's at the Vatican. It's an exciting job. Every time Pope Francis gets near a microphone, she has a story. But how did...
Sometimes when he's off mic, too.
Yeah. How did David, as a teacher, as a person, affect your choice to be a journalist? And then I want to ask you later about David's faith.
All right. Turbulent times for journalism. When I was studying with David, it was turbulent times for journalism. Every professor told us, "You're never going to get a job. Thanks for coming here. Thanks for learning about this and all the sacrifices you're making, but things are going south. There's no future in this industry. You have to learn how to do CEO. You have to learn how to understand data analysis. You have to learn how to do a million things." And we just felt so lost, And, David wasn't the best professor. He would start a sentence, and then he'd quote people and things and articles that we had no idea what he was talking about. But he would give us so much hope, just hope that we could do it. And I'll second what you were saying earlier, but in the doom and gloom of what journalism was, and even worse is today, it felt that there was a way to do this job, and that all the changes that were happening, we could survive and thrive. And that feeling stuck with me. And before coming here, I reached out to some of my fellow students in that class, and it stuck with them. I mean, we talk about a Carr generation. There's people working at Al Jazeera in Pakistan. There's people working in Bangkok, all these students all over the world who say, yeah, he told me that I could do this, even when they had to quit their jobs, even when COVID broke and things got bad and they were all kind of still on their ropes. He told us that, the challenges, be brave about them. And maybe I know there are big challenges in journalism, of course. I'm not blind to them. And, David, to get to your second question, what's more religious than a prophet? He was in his chaotic speeches, which could be long, there would be something like a nugget, a diamond amid all this stuff that would just leave you, wow. And those remain relevant today. And with artificial intelligence and with all the things that are happening, it's still true. And I found myself thinking so much about the things that he taught us still today. You know, we did a sort of final project with him. We all worked so hard. It was probably the project that we wanted to work out the best, because we wanted to hear David say, well done, which never happened. But you could maybe get a little glint in his eye that showed that he thought it didn't suck. And we'd appreciate that. And I, walked into his office, and there's the XX concert tickets, and there's all these funny stuff all over, and he had made that place his own so quickly. And we had a chat. I walk out, and I never talked to him about faith. I'd read his book. There's a beautiful passage where he talks about his daughters, and he goes back to church, and the priest tells him, welcome home. I think about that so often. And I was too shy to talk to him about faith. I thought, what does he care about, religion? But I recently interviewed a Jesuit who's an astrophysicist. Makes sense. And he said, for those of us who believe that God is the truth, unveiling the truth is like seeing the face of God. And us who were students of David's felt like we were disciples, warriors of truth. And in a way, that sentiment of trying to, it's a battle. You have to get in the mud. Sometimes you don't know what is true. I mean, we're flawed. Sometimes we make mistakes, and you have to own up to them. But if you keep going towards that, there's something worthwhile on the other side.
That's terrific. Part of David that's not known is how his faith and the spiritual foundations of recovery played a big part in his life and his work and his family and his hope. We have had a very rich discussion. We need to take some time for questions. There isn't a lot of time. We have a couple people with microphones. Why don't we take a couple questions at a time and then ask our panelists to respond to one or the other? If you want to ask a question, put up your hand, and one of our folks, we got two over here and a couple over there, okay? Let me give you my line. I used to think I was known for substance. Now I'm only known for, please put your question in the form of a question.
Okay.
Identify yourself, though.
It doesn't, oh, it is on. Okay. Hi, I'm Kesley. I'm a rising senior at Georgetown studying history. I'm actually an intern at the Emerson Collective this summer, which is really fabulous because I know that Ta-Nehisi wrote for the Atlantic, so really cool. My question is about for-profit journalism and how, what do you guys think about how, this question has been sitting on my mind for weeks, but how do you think that for-profit journalism has continues to threaten journalism or as a practice, if that makes sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
How about the person behind you, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Hi, good evening. My name is Fernando Muñoz. I am a lawyer from Ecuador. When I wanted to go to college, I wanted to study journalism because my family has a radio station, and they wouldn't let me study journalism. They told me to go to law school. But when I studied the equal of the First Amendment in Ecuador, which is the right of freedom of speech, that's where my two words combined, the profession of my family and my own profession as a lawyer. So my question would be, how often do you think about the First Amendment, about freedom of speech, the right itself in your week, in your average week.
Okay. Who would like to respond? Profit in journalism and freedom of speech as what do you think?
On the for-profit thing, I mean, I certainly hope the profit model works. It's sort of like what I'm dependent on, and Jake too, and so I certainly hope it works because also I think the nonprofit model is good, but it's by no means a panacea, and actually it depends on a lot of the same forces, which is just money to keep it going. It's interesting to see all the innovative things that are working and some that are not working. I just wanted to point out there's an innovative entrepreneur here, CityCast Chief David Plotz. This is a series of locally focused podcasts. I listen to the DC one all the time. It's amazing. It's really good. Brings in local stuff. I hope it's profitable. I don't know any of the finances, but anyway, that's an example of sort of like people doing different things, especially in the local space. There's a lot to talk about, more than we have time for, but let me just say that I hope so, because otherwise we're really all in a lot of trouble. And someone else can talk about the first.
Amanda, you have a podcast. Is it profitable?
I was co-hosting.
have to.
Okay. Oh, God.
I want to call attention to the fact that she has a podcast. What about this idea of freedom of speech? The conflict thing you deal with, people are asserting all these absolutes and trying to take down the capacity of others to assert their absolutes. How do you build up the common ground where we actually listen to each other?
I feel like my answer to this is going to be unpopular and maybe wrong. So, Jake?
Well, I think that we are very lucky to live in a country that has a First Amendment. And even though obviously it is not absolute, there are a number of things you cannot do with your speech. A lot of the countries that we cover on my show and that CNN International has to contend with on a daily basis are dependent on an acknowledgement of the fact that a lot of countries we cover don't have freedom of speech, and in fact, that means that people like Evan Gershkovich can be thrown in jail for trumped up charges. When we have journalists in countries that don't have those freedoms, we have to be careful on what they say and how they say it in a way that would really probably surprise most of you. And there isn't, the freedom of speech and freedom of the press that we enjoy in this country, I feel like we take for granted quite a bit. And there are countries where literally if you say something, like it's not even explicitly stated, if you say something or show something you're not supposed to show, you get killed by the government. It just happens. In England, they have basically a commission that listens to complaints, and people can be removed from the air. I'm not complaining. Yeah, I'm not comparing that to being killed, but it's also something that I'm glad we don't have in this country. I've gotten into many arguments with progressive friends of mine who are sure that they have the solution to false right-wing media beyond just defamation settlements in court. And none of them are workable. None of them make any sense. All of them depend on, some combination of
the FCC,
Rachel Maddow and the green room at MSNBC deciding who sits on this commission. We are just very lucky. And yes, there is a cost for it, and it is kind of scurrilous journalism, bad journalism, purposefully misleading journalism, lazy journalism, sloppy journalism, and all sorts of other stuff. But at the end of the day, we're really, really fortunate that the Founding Fathers came up with that one.
Okay.
Sorry,
Sure.
What was your name? Yes. So I just want to say, I just want to tell you that your question was really, really important. And I think something that happens sometimes, and I'm certainly not critiquing anybody on this panel, or Eric's answer, is because we don't have the answer for something right now, we decide that the question is not worthwhile because we don't have a practical, workable answer right now. And I just want to say that just because this panel of older journalists, except you, don't have the answer right now, it doesn't mean like your question is not worthwhile. I think the question of deciding whether information is valuable based on whether you can sell it or not is a very, very important question. And I really think it's something that like journalists of your generation should be thinking about and thinking about solutions and other ways to maybe get information to people. And so I don't want you to feel like just because we don't have here's step A, B, C, D, that means that the question is not a real question. Just because you don't have the cure for cancer doesn't mean that someone shouldn't be working on cancer,
Absolutely. It's the question, to be honest. I mean, there are people right now trying to figure out how CNN, how the Washington Post, how the Atlantic, how a religious news service is going to exist in 2030, 2035, 2040. I mean, it is the question.
How about a couple questions over here?
Hello, good evening. I'm 24. My name is Sophia, and I work as a freelance writer and federal consultant. And I think one of the illuminating themes of tonight has been the role and responsibility of journalists. But if you'll indulge me, I'd love to turn that question on its head and ask about the role and responsibility of the reader. And I'm thinking specifically of my generation that often consumes and digests news through social media. So the question is, how do we remain judicious, sensitive, intelligent, principled in how we engage with information?
Okay, thank you. Very thoughtful. Another one over there. There's one right there.
Hi, my name is Mitch Riles. I'm actually an editor at City Paper currently. And selfishly, I'd like to know what all of you think is maybe the most undercovered or incorrectly covered or most important story right now.
Okay. Responsibility of readers, especially younger readers, and what should be covered now. Someone ought to write a story about that. How about Claire? Younger readers?
Oh boy, this is a difficult one. We talked about trust, and so trust is definitely a two-way street. We've got to earn the trust of readers on one side, but readers have to be willing to kind of do the other part. The only way I can think of explaining this it's a very complicated question, is when you go to the grocery store and there's all these different kinds of cereal. There's so much cereal, especially here in the US, and I live in Rome. And you look at the ingredients. Or you can just get the brand you've seen an ad for, or maybe you'll get the brand that your parents would get, or the one you had growing up. But if you're a consumer who's informed, then you read everything. It takes a little extra work, but it's good in the end. Today, there's so much information and so many options that readers have to do a little extra work to understand where they should get their information. And I know that we're all so busy and we have so much to do. The problem is that journalists can't tell you, read this guy and this guy and this guy, because why should you trust us? But if you figure out who is trustworthy and who you think you can read, and if you do that extra work, then that's enough of a basis to go forward. I don't know if this answers the question, but it's the best I can offer.
Eric, what's being uncovered?
Come on, Coach.
What's being undercovered? Oh, God.
I don't remember him having a problem with this with this question back in the 90s.
I don't know. I just think on a local level, just about everything. I mean, like, we at the Post Luz Lasso, I don't know if that name rings a bell. She covered transportation really, really well. She left in the buyout. I don't have as much information on transportation in the district, which is a tremendously important topic, which not only is important for our district budget, but it's on equity and it's on everything. It's on the viability of a city. I'm not saying that my paper isn't, doing its best to do so, but like, we lost 20 people out of Metro or something in the buyouts. And we're, I think, at about maybe 1/3 of the staffing that we had in when I first started covering the Post in 2002. I think the Post Metro section had 225 people. I think they're around 70, 75 maybe right now. And they still do an amazing job with those resources, don't get me wrong. But that would be something I think is undercovered. They're going to discontinue the circulator buses in the city. And I would like to know more about all the economics of that and so on and so forth. So transportation, I think, is a really important thing.
Eric?
Yes, sorry.
I read that you're helping out. You write some editorials on local issues for the Post?
I did, and then I switched back to full-time media because that was just really kind of crazy. But I mean, it was fun. And I wanted to do the rotation, but it was just not.
It occurred to me when you rode your bike over here tonight that might be the reason why the Post obsessively called for more bike lanes.
I did write a bike lane editorial.
Yeah. What's uncovered and what are the responsibilities of readers? You talk about responsibility of all of us.
I mean, I think, so one of my favorite things to do these days is to train journalists. So we've trained a bunch of journalists about how to cover conflict and controversy differently. Because in a time of just constant dysfunctional conflict, functioning is interesting. So trying to come up with different frames, different source archetypes is really fun and refreshing. So one of the things we teach is to investigate the understory of a conflict your community's in. There's, for every conflict, the thing it seems to be about, right? And then the thing it's really about. So usually, as journalists, we don't touch the understory. We just kind of flit around just saying who said what to whom and who did what and who paid for what. But usually it's about respect and recognition, care and concern, power and control. I've long thought there should be someone just covering humiliation at every newsroom, and its opposite, dignity, because most violent conflict is about humiliation. And the humiliators then humiliate. So there's a lot of good stuff there, right? That is not about, he said this about immigration and she said this about abortion. It's that's all important, but it's at a certain point, and I think Carr would be with me in saying it's boring. The way it gets covered is repetitive, predictable at this point, and boring. But there's this whole rich understory that isn't covered. So
We couldn't go on, but we're already over. What I would like to do is to ask each of our guests if there's something you really wanted to say to this group about journalism that you did not get to say. This is your moment. And the other question is, if journalism is a vocation, how does that make it different? And why did you choose that as your vocation? So something you wanted to say and didn't, or why have you chosen this vocation of journalism? Let's just go down the line.
So the thing I just was sitting here thinking about was, Jake was saying how much he wanted David to be alive right now, just to see what he would have made in the past 8 years or so. And I think the thing that I miss, that I would urge all young journalists to cultivate, he just had this great eye for bullshit. You know what I mean? He would have spotted crypto right away. He'd have been like, and I feel like, we're kind of, and I might be wrong about this, and I'm willing to, I have a lot of emotion in this, but I'm willing to say I might well be wrong about this. But a lot of the coverage of AI, I feel like is bullshit right now. Like it's not that there isn't a core technology, these large language models, but we are getting to the phase where these things are starting to become like marketing terms, and you're like losing sight of what is the actual mechanism that he had like no fear at all of like some of us sit back and we don't want to ask the question because we don't want to be perceived as stupid, and he had no problem just asking that question. You know what I mean? And like, it is a remarkable technique for catching bullshitters. And he was just so good at that. And I feel like that is a thing that is missing from a lot of journalism now. What was the second thing? I forgot.
Amanda?
Or is that it?
That was good.
That was good.
You're good. You're done.
You said
You're
enough.
done.
Covered it all.
Yeah, that was great. I don't know. I mean, I think when I look back at my career, if I could do it again, I would probably spend a lot less time trying to be clever and a lot more time trying to be useful. So that would be it's not a charism. It's just not. It's too linear. It's like, but that would be my like tip.
A couple F words in there. Okay, Jake?
I think my answer is probably more personal, and I'm sure it reflects what everybody on this stage feels, which is, I remember everything about the moment when my wife told me David died. I remember where I was, I remember how I felt, I remember where I was standing in the room, and I can't say that about, I'm 55, I've lost a lot of people in my life, family members and friends and others, colleagues, and I can't say that about most of them, that tangible feeling. And like Ta-Nehisi, I wish that he had seen us all. Eric, he'd be so proud of the media writer you are. You're the best media writer in America, period. Now, of course, he's obligated to do a hit piece on me. That's how his mind works. The gears are shifting. But I just do want to say to those of you out there who are students, who are young journalists, or even if you're not in journalism at all and you're a young lawyer or a young professor or whatever, like, take advantage of the mentors you have in your life, and just, you're going to lose them before you know it, and you're going to lose them when you're not ready for it, and just take advantage of it. If there are people in your life that are willing to teach you things and yell at you when you're wrong, and see things in you before you even see them. Like, he used to talk about how I was going to end up in TV, and I'm like, I don't know what are you talking about? I'm a city paper writer. He's like, yeah, when you end up in TV, anyway. He saw things, like Ta-Nehisi said. Just take advantage of that, because, life is short.
Claire?
How do I second that? Wow. Well, one thing is, when I think of vocation, I think of a service. I think that I'm not doing this for me. And as I was starting as a reporter, I had a very big, healthy ego, and I really wanted to prove myself to the world. And David did his best with all of us to kind of whack it back, and as he battled with his impressive ego as well. And it was, I would just say this, you don't, if you're out there and you want to be a journalist, you don't necessarily have to want to do it to be a big name or very famous or have the renown of everyone. I find that the happiest moments in journalism are when someone, living in nowhere and comes up to me and says, this piece was really great. And if you do that tirelessly, continuously, it really matters. And yeah.
Eric?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question by reciting a T-shirt. David had a white T-shirt, a very white T-shirt that he often wore with like a black or navy blue button-down flannel corduroy shirt. He often had his really baggy jeans on and the black sneakers. And that white T-shirt said, "Will write for food." And that's really all you need to know. that's my favorite mental picture of David Carr, which has been flashing up all night. So that's my answer.
There are 1,000 of those. My favorite is, what's the cure for writer's block?
Typing.
Typing. This discussion has been recorded and will be posted on our website. We have follow-up resources, including the books and articles by these wonderful people. We're going to have a wonderful set of dialogues in the fall on the election, the role of young voters, the loss of trust in institutions, social isolation and democracy, faithful political engagement before and after the election, Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, and other international conflicts, and Catholic teaching on war and peace. Please visit our website. I want to thank my colleagues, Kim Daniels, Kim Mazik, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sonnen for all their work in putting this dialogue together. My final comment is, somebody talked about hope and agency and tough times. And I just was struck by the fact, if anyone doubts that journalism matters or that one person can make a difference, remember tonight. Listen what you saw and heard about vocation, about truth, about hard work, about encouragement, about loyalty, about faith, hope, and love. Look at the leaders on this stage. Look at the women in David's family and his new grandchild. David has a grandchild named David. And look at all of us gathered here and online. One life does matter. Our work matters. Our support and our solidarity with one another matters. So join me in thanking Ta-Nehisi Coates, Claire Gingrave, Amanda Ripley, Jake Tapper, and Eric Wemple for a wonderful discussion.